Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl, and I'm joined today by my friends Chris and Joel, and we're going to be talking about Ethernet networking for audio pros. This is level 2, and we're going to be speaking kind of about how to interface and talk to the IT department. But before we dive into all that important and interesting information, just a few items of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it about a week or so after the webinar. What you can do is go to shure.com/training. You can find all of our webinars there. We have a lot of different topics covered and a lot of great learning, so please feel free to go there, peruse past webinars, and as I said, this one should be available in about a week or so at shure.com/training. Second of all, as we go through the session today, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the question pane. We will be doing questions and answers at the end of the session, so type them in and be a little patient. If you can't see that question pane, just look for a little gray toolbar probably in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and on that toolbar you'll see an orange box with a white arrow. Click on that, and then you should be able to access the question bar. So we're looking forward to all your interesting questions. Type them up, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. So that concludes all the nuts and bolts. Let's get into the interesting stuff. Take it away, Chris and Joel.
Thank you, Cheryl, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. Joel, there's a lot of confusion in the AV and IT markets these days because people say, well, AV people and IT people sometimes speaking different languages. Believe it or not, I have some people here convinced that I know everything, and today I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna say I don't know absolutely everything, and the content.
You heard it here first.
And I
It's
think that
recorded.
was recorded. Yes, we'll edit that. It'll be a clip or something like that. It'll be a ringtone. But believe it or not, we do have people here who do know lots about different things, and that's why Joel's here today as a more recent member of our system support group. He comes from more of an IT background, and so what we're going to talk about today are a lot of things that are strange, foreign, and new to audio people with an AV background, but are kind of commonplace for IT people. So we're going to kind of talk about what IT people are going to want to know when you want to put audio on an enterprise network. We'll talk about transmission methods and flows versus channels, and that was completely new to me. And then we'll talk about setting up the switch and choosing the right switch, which surprisingly enough, even though switches are everywhere these days, you can buy them at Walgreens practically. That can be one of the most difficult things to get right. And then we'll wind up just talking about the top 5 problems that we see people encountering with networked audio. So let's dive right in. First of all, networked audio is pretty much the new normal.
Yes.
Everybody's
Yes,
trying to do it. It has so many advantages and efficiencies, and if you're unfamiliar with some of these concepts, we did a webinar in October, I believe, that was sort of an introductory treatment of networking for audio professionals, and it covered a lot of very basic topics like subnets and IP addresses and so forth like that. You might want to go back and listen to that one first if you haven't already, because we're going to kind of springboard off from there and move forward.
And that's at shure.com/training.
That's right. Thank you very much. So networked audio is the new normal. What are the IT people going to want to know? They're going to ask a lot of questions, Joel, right?
That's correct. Especially, how many devices are you looking to put on the network? If there are a large number of Dante or networked audio devices, they may interfere with, say, printers or computers. As soon as you start putting more and more devices on a network, whether they're networked audio or whether they're just regular computers, servers, and printers, you're going to have quite a bit of traffic running across that network. So finding out how many devices you're going to add to the network is the first thing that you would want to tell the IT person that you're speaking with. And then secondly, how many IP addresses you're going to use on each device. Some of our devices in the networked audio realm, they take 2 IPs per device, one for control, for sending control strings, for getting to the web interface, for getting to the web GUI, but also the second IP address for Dante and Dante audio. That one, they should both live on the same subnet or the same network, so you can both control and see the Dante audio from them. But these 2 IPs can essentially double what is considered the amount of devices on your network. Since we're not dealing with a printer, which really has just 1 IP, we're not dealing with a computer, which has also one IP address. Some of our devices, such as the MXA 910 and the MXA 310, they also have two IP addresses on them. So just keeping that in mind and taking that into consideration whenever you're designing your networked audio system will be helpful for both you and the IT systems engineer or IT manager that you're dealing with.
And then what about IP addressing, static versus DHCP? That's a pothole you can sometimes step into.
It is, especially with more closed networks. When you're working with your IT manager or IT team, they will either give you a DHCP pool, which is just a pool of IP addresses that you can use on their network, or they'll say you have free reign of this part of the network. You can assign these addresses statically if you want. Static meaning you will give it an address, for example, 192.168.1.100. The next IP address will be 101, 102, and so on. Or if you're not setting static IP addresses for these networked audio devices, you can just plug them in, and by DHCP, they will gather an IP address automatically. You can just plug them in, and it's just as easy as that. They will request an IP address from some DHCP server or pool and populate their own IP addresses that way.
And what about ports? Does it matter which ports you're using? Do certain ports have to be active, or is it just the number of ports available that's important?
There are certain things you would want to look out for when plugging these devices into switches, whereas some of our networked audio devices, they only have one port, but they have two IP addresses. And there are certain protocols that you will want to look out for. I believe we have an FAQ on the IP ports and protocols for our MXA, MXW devices and other networked audio devices, which will help you gain an understanding of how to open the web GUI, how to allow certain ports and protocols through your network for features to work on all of the devices.
And as we mentioned, we did one called Networking Basics for Audio Professionals a couple of months ago. You might want to go back and review that if you're a little confused about things like DHCP and devices and ports and so forth, because Gino and Sam Drazen did a great job of explaining all those concepts, so that's worth watching. Let's talk about transmission methods, and this was something I wasn't familiar with. How the data gets from point A to point, Q, R, and Z on the network. There's basically three methods of transmitting messages. The simplest one is unicast, right?
Correct, yes. One-to-one, going from one device, whether that's your Dante transmitter to a Dante receiver.
And our Dante audio flows are generally unicast by default, right? That's the way they normally are.
Generally are unicast by default. Once you open Dante controller and set a transmitter to send to a receiver, that is a unicast flow from that transmitter to that receiver.
Okay. Then another possibility is, there's a second unicast flow there. Another possibility is multicast, where we're going from one sender to multiple receivers, but it's handled a little differently here.
Yes, in a multicast setting, when you're sending to more than two devices, Dante controller will make you create a multicast flow. And in multicast, you're sending from one transmitter to multiple receivers. That can be 3 or more receivers. Also, in that instance, multicast is used for sending clock sync, as well as Bonjour Discovery, MDNS. That's what we use for our Shure web device discovery application. And also AES67, which some of our devices speak to, say, QSC Core 110s that also support AES67 as a different networked audio protocol.
So in this case, it's almost like the transmitting device sends the audio data to the switch with a little list attached of, and here's the people that are supposed to receive this. Make sure they all get this, okay? Almost like dropping off a big bundle of magazines or mailing pieces at the post office and saying, send it to the people in this zip code.
Exactly. And in multicast, you have what are called groups, a multicast group, where a sender is sending to that group, and then you have receivers who are also listening to that group. Like, say, I want this information. It's much different than the next transmission method that we have.
Right, and that one's broadcast. And in this case, we're just sending the same signal to everybody, whether they asked for it or not. It's just like, through a paging system. Hey, everybody, look at this.
Everyone has access to see it. As you add more devices to your network, though, that can become a problem, as you can tell with maybe, for example, mailing or some other way where they're sending all of the information to everyone. They don't necessarily want it, and it takes them time. It takes the switch or whichever network device time to process that information.
And not only that, it might kind of clog up the network with a bunch of messages that are essentially unnecessary because they're not really needed by all those receiving devices.
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Dante because Dante does, some people who haven't dealt with Dante are afraid that, all this traffic's going to overwhelm my network. Or they might think that Dante has to be on its own private network, which isn't the case, right? It can coexist on an enterprise network that's also being used for email or whatever.
That is correct. You can use Dante on your corporate LAN or on an isolated LAN where you have just your network switch and your Dante devices. Or they can, in fact, live on the same network as your computers, your printers and servers, or even other AV equipment, for that matter, because Dante audio traffic between a receiver and a transmitter is unicast by default. You're only sending from one thing to the other thing. And typically, that does not take much bandwidth at all. It's only when you're using broadcast transmission, in the case Dante does not use that, broadcast transmission sort of floods everyone with information that they don't need.
Right. And we've got some numbers there for what kind of bandwidth typical Dante numbers of channels take up, and you can see that if you have a gigabit Ethernet, it's not really a lot of percentage of the overall traffic capacity. It might be more of a factor if you're using a 100 Ethernet instead of a 1 gigabyte Ethernet, right?
That's correct. Yes. Some of the older switches and some switches that are still out there are 10-100, in which they're not transmitting at the fullest speed we have currently available, which is either gigabit. Sometimes there's also a 10 gig speed, but for most cases, it is a gigabit connection. And as you can see from the chart, 4 channels, 16, even 64 channels of audio streaming over your network or through your switch uses a very small percentage comparatively to, say, internet traffic or email or streaming from the internet and such.
And Dante can actually work on those slower networks, but nowadays you should really, if you're running audio networking or AV networking, you should really be thinking about using the higher 1 gigabyte Ethernet speeds, right?
Yes, that is correct. Since we have gigabit switches available, 10-100 is sort of phasing out right now. It's best to go gigabit all the way.
Okay. Now let's talk about this concept of flows, because this was something that I really had to work hard to get my head around. And so a flow is a sequence of packets that are being sent to an IP address, and the packets have got audio in them. But the concept of the wagon kind of came to my mind as this is sort of the transport bin that has got all this data in it. And, in most cases with Dante, one flow holds 4 audio channels, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Now, the key thing that really kind of blew my mind was that a flow is also a flow even if it only has one audio channel in it. If you only put one channel in it, you're still occupying the entire flow, and it still counts as one flow. And whether or not, so those other 3 channels that it could be carrying, they're still sort of there as sort of vacant channels. And this is an unfamiliar concept for audio people, because if you're plugging in 3 microphones to a mixing board, you've got 3 microphone cables, it only takes up 3 inputs. This concept is a little bit like, you're using a snake to plug in 1 microphone, and because it's a 4-channel snake, you're going to have to plug in all 4 plugs into the mixer, and you're going to occupy 4 channels, even though you're only using 1 microphone. And I think that's kind of a foreign concept for some people.
Yes, and some devices that you'll see, they can either utilize up to 2 flows or up to 32 flows. But either way, using one flow, you will use up to 4 channels for that flow. Whether you're using one of them or you're 2 or 3 or 4, you will use that whole 4 channel for that flow.
Well, let's look at this a little bit more here and talk about, how these get actually used in an application here. So we know each flow supports up to 4 channels, and the maximum number of flows that a device can handle depends on the chipset that it has. And this is where it really is important to know the hardware that you're using, right?
That is correct. Yes, for some of our devices, SEM820, our MXW access point, most MXW ANI, and the MXA 910 can support up to 32 flows, transmit and receive. That comes along with the Brooklyn 2 chipset. There is the other Ultimo chipset that's a part of our MXA 310, ANI 4 ins and ANI 4 outs. In this regard, I've seen in some examples or some cases where a user is trying to send audio from 3 devices, say 3 MXA 910s, to an ANI 4N device, and you can't do that because the ANI 4N only accepts 2 flows, meaning up to
Let's
2.
let's talk about this a little bit more detail here because I
Mhm.
think this is one of those times where I really had to see it in a graphic before I could get my head around it. So let's say on the right there we've got 2 MXA 310 table array microphones,
Yes.
and we've got two. It can send out 2 flows. That's the limit of that device. So let's say flow number 1 might have uh, the 4 individual audio channels of the MXA 310, like 4 cardioid outputs, let's say.
Hmm.
And the other flow might have 3 of those mics plus the auto mix out, might be our 4th channel. So those 2 flows are going through the network, and then they're arriving at our 2 receiving devices, which let's say they're ANI 4 ins or something like that, and or ANI 4 outs. And so flow number 1 goes to one device, flow number 2 goes to the other device, and that's the maximum number of flows. So that's all we can do now with that setup, correct?
That is correct. Using the Ultimo chipset that is in the MXA 310 and ANI 4 ins and 4 outs, you are capped at the max number of flows, which is 2.
So if I wanted to have a third ANI 4 out, let's say, I can't send another flow to it because the 310 is not capable of sending a third flow there.
Yep, that's exactly correct.
Okay, so that was one thing. Let's look at another possible example here. So here's a multicast setup where now we're taking a 1 flow from the MXA 310 with our 4 audio channels on it. That goes through the network. But now, because we're doing multicast, the network switch is doing some of the work here and is saying, okay, I'll take your 1 flow and I'll make sure I repeat it to these 3 destinations here. So in that case, by using multicast, I could achieve sending that 1 flow to 3 different devices, correct?
That is correct. Yes, using a multicast flow, you're using only 1 flow from the MXA 310. In that regard, you're going to multiple receivers, and those receivers also show as 1 flow, so you're not maxing out your number of flows on either device.
And the key thing is that those flows, those multicast flows, need to be the same. Everybody's getting the same thing there.
That's correct. Everyone would receive the same Dante audio.
All right, now here we've got another example with some unicast flows from multiple devices, because this is a situation that also comes up. What if I've got 4 MXA 310s on a table, and I want to take the auto mix output from each one of them and go through the network and send that to an ANI 4 out? Now, at first glance, an audio person would say, well, I've got 4 audio channels there, the 4 auto mix outputs from those 4 microphones. That's 4 channels. I've got a device that can handle 4 audio
4 channels, yep.
4 equals 4 should be no
All good,
problem,
right?
right? Why won't this work?
In this case, the ANI 4 out also has 2 receive flows that it can receive from devices. So you have 4 devices there. Even if you're sending 1 channel from the MXA 310, you're still using 1 flow. 1 flow, in some regards, can be called 1 device. And if you're trying to send more than 2 to the ANI 4 out, you won't be able to because you have exceeded your number of flows to that device.
And how does that actually appear if I try to do this? Do I just not see those additional flows and wonder how come I can't find them? Or
In Dante controller, once you try to create additional audio routes to the ANI4 route, you'll most likely get a symbol, circle, and a line through it saying, no, we cannot do this. You've reached the maximum number of flows for this device.
okay, so it does take a little bit of forethought and planning to sort of say, well, okay, here's what I want to do, and how is this all going to map out, and do all the numbers add up here? Okay, good. And here's another example. I think it's a different graphic showing pretty much the same thing. Our auto mix outputs going through the network. Everybody's happy for the first two flows, but the second two flows are going to cause a problem here. So that's where we're
Exactly.
going to run into some
And
problems.
that symbol is what you will most likely see in Dante controller when you try to create those additional flows.
Got it. So instead, you could do it a different way by substituting a different device. Down there at the bottom, we've got the MXW ANI, which can handle 32 flows.
Correct.
And so it wouldn't have any problem taking those 4 flows from those 4 MXA 310s. All right, let's talk about switches, because this is something that seems so simple on the outside. It's a box with some plugs on it, and they're everywhere. But the switch that you choose is really important. What is it that people need to be looking for the right switch?
It's probably one of the most important parts of the equation. Besides the equipment that you're using, it's the switch, sort of the brains of the operation, which is sending that Dante audio traffic to receivers and transmitters. One thing you want to look out for, or a few things, to make sure it is a managed switch. Managed meaning you can log into it via a web interface through either command line, or you can go to its IP address of the switch and log in and see all of the settings. Some switches say they are either smart managed or web managed, so you'll need to look out for whether it's fully managed or if it just gives you a subset of features. You'll need to also make sure that it is a gigabit switch. 10100 switches are being phased out nowadays. Gigabit will give you potentially 10 times the speed of network traffic over that switch. But also keep in mind that a lot of these devices, the MXA 310 and the MXA 910, are also PoE powered. So you'll need to have a switch in place that can power these devices, but also have enough power to power all of the devices on your network.
Right, and we should point out some devices are PoE, and some devices need the higher capacity PoE plus.
Correct.
So you want to make sure you choose a switch that has that capability if you're using devices like that.
Indeed, yes. The P300, I believe, is a PoE plus device. It may power on with a PoE switch, but I believe eventually over time that P300 will certain features will stop working if you don't give it enough power, and you could potentially damage that product.
Got it. Okay, so in addition to power and management and so forth, then once we've got the right switch, now we've got to set it up the right way. And it doesn't just do it right out of the box, so we need to make sure we check the right boxes and tweak the right settings. So let's talk about those. What's that first one there?
Energy efficient Ethernet, or also sometimes called green Ethernet. If you're purchasing a switch that has green Ethernet or energy efficient Ethernet built in, that can be used to disable ports when there's not enough traffic going through that port. Say you have a Dante audio route going through a switch, and maybe there's no audio or something's muted. If you have energy efficient Ethernet turned on, or a switch that is unmanaged with that turned on, that could disable your ports or disable your audio. All of a sudden, you'll see the Dante audio routed, but you won't hear anything. And even if the port comes back alive, according to Audinate, created Dante, that can be detrimental to Dante audio routes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then what about multicast capability? We said most Dante flows are unicast. Why might we want to have that multicast capability?
You'll need multicast in order to do a discovery for our applications such as the web device discovery tool, the Shure update utility. I believe also Wireless Workbench uses Bonjour service, MDNS is what it's called, which uses multicast to discover our devices. MXW also uses clock sync, and many of our other devices use a precision time protocol, which is multicast, and AES67 is also a multicast protocol. You would want to make sure whichever switch that you are using can indeed traverse or move multicast packets through its switch ports.
Okay, and this last one, configure IGMP snooping. Now, I confess the first time Joel mentioned this, I was like, oh, come on, you are making this up, man. This is not a real thing. But it is a real thing, and it's so much so that we have an entire FAQ about it at shure.com/FAQ. If you search for IGMP, you'll get the story on IGMP snooping. You need to configure that if it's going to be necessary. So let's talk a little bit more about IGMP snooping and exactly what that is about.
Yes, Internet Group Management Protocol, Internet Group Protocol Management, actually, is what this is used for. It's a way to traffic or police multicast data. Initially, multicast will flood the network looking for receivers or looking for groups that it needs to send to. And as you add more devices to the network, or as you are adding it to a larger corporate network, that multicast data can become troublesome or start to bog down other components of the system if it isn't managed correctly. And that is what that protocol IGMP is used for.
Okay, and then some devices, sometimes the switch has to act as the querier, the one that's asking, hey, device number 7, do you want this information? Device number 9, what about you? Do you want this information?
Correct. The querier is used to basically query the network and say, hey, is anyone on the network at any of the ports on the switch looking for this information at address, for example, 224003, which is a multicast address? Is anyone looking for information here? Please respond back. And then the switch will get a membership report back from that device saying, yes, I do want to listen to this information. Please send it my way. Otherwise, IGMP will filter traffic to the other ports on the switch. That way you can sort of create a more efficient networking scheme on your switch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what if we have just a basic, simple configuration? Do we always need IGMP snooping enabled, or are there times where we might not really need it?
There are times when you really won't need it at all, especially for small networks, or if you have an isolated switch where it's just your devices talking back and forth to each other. In those cases, you really won't need IGMP. It's a service that potentially has the effect of disabling discovery. You won't see anything in web discovery. You won't see anything in the Shure update utility. And sometimes that is because IGMP is either enabled and not configured correctly, or enabled and there's some courier that's not querying enough. So if it's a small isolated network, it's not managed by any IT staff, you don't have a lot of multicast traffic going through, and it's dedicated only for your AV equipment, then we recommend, also Audinate recommends, disabling that IGMP snooping.
Mm-hmm. But if you are going to be using it, you should probably touch base with the IT staff to make sure that it gets set up the right way. Maybe check with the manufacturer of the AV equipment to find out, what sorts of timings or regularity, the devices are expecting to be queried, or things like that. You want to just make sure that everything's kind of working harmoniously there.
Yep.
All right, quality of service. This is probably a concept that more people are familiar with because it comes up in the phone business and the telephony side of the business quite a bit. But really, when we're talking about really fast networks now, is this really even that big of a deal anymore?
Not as much anymore, and rarely have I seen it implemented on gigabit networks. It was more of a case for 10100 networks that you would want to set QoS, what are called queues or priorities for all of the data that's coming through. But it was more so recommended for those slower 10100 networks.
Okay, so if you're dealing with a slower network, you need to worry about this, but not so much with faster ones. All right, and then VLANs. This is an easy way that you can kind of separate your network audio from control strings or other traffic. And if you've got a larger network, sometimes it's useful to be able to compartmentalize these things a little bit, right? And establish some restrictions.
Yes, and working with, say, your IT staff or on your switch, you would maybe want to create a separate VLAN strictly for network audio and control, separate from, say, your corporate LAN that has other computers, switches, wireless access points on them, just so the traffic is either easier to manage, but also you're not flooding traffic from one segment of the corporate network to your audio VLAN and vice versa.
Right. So basically, PCs and printers outside the AV network don't need to see the AV network and vice versa. So
Mhm.
they can kind of be on the same network, but sort of be on separate lanes.
Correct. Separate lanes, and that's also a good security feature as well, just to keep certain things isolated from people who don't necessarily need access to them.
That's a good point. If security is a concern in an install, then using VLANs is one way that you can create some restrictions so that users outside of the meeting room, outside of the AV network, aren't able to connect to the AV network and possibly monitor some of the audio channels that are going on inside the meeting room.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, so let's summarize configuring switches here. We want to make sure that you use the right switch. In fact, we've got an FAQ on our website now where we talk about disqualified switches, which are the ones you don't want to use. Audinate also has a document on their website, and I think we even link to it. And then in general, though, the type of switch you want is a gigabit managed switch with power over Ethernet capability. You want to make sure you disable the energy efficient Ethernet and disable IGMP snooping on small networks unless for some reason you know that you need it and want it. What are some of the common tools that people are using to set these things up?
First off, in order to see IP addresses, to see whether you are on the same subnet as one of our devices, we use a Shure Web Device Discovery application. That's a simple way to open the web GUI as well of a device. Most of our networked audio components will show on Web Device Discovery, granted that you have multicast/bonjour service running and it's running on your network. Also, the Shure update utility is what we use to push firmware to also troubleshoot devices that are on the network AV. There's also Dante controller, in which we use to route audio from transmitters to receivers, either in a unicast or a multicast way. You can also use Dante controller to set up AES67 for the MXA 910 or other AES67 capable transmitters. And optionally, you can use Dante Virtual Sound Card to receive Dante audio to your computer, but also send Dante audio from your computer out to the network. In the example of auditioning, say, an MXA 910 or an MXA 310, if you don't have, say, a headphone amplifier or a Dante-enabled headphone amp to listen or audition those channels on the MXA 910, you could install Dante Virtual Sound Card on your computer and then create the routes from the 910 to your computer to listen to lobes when you're setting that up for a client.
So you can be steering the lobes and setting them up in the room while you're listening in real time and knowing,
Correct.
is that working, is that right?
Yep.
Which is a lot more convenient, especially if you're doing it single-handedly.
Exactly, yes.
All right, let's talk about the top 5 problems that we see. And by we, I mean Joel, not me. Let's talk about each one of these. First of all, devices or computer not on the same subnet.
So whenever you have a device, and maybe you see it in the Shure Web Device Discovery application, and it's on a different subnet, but for some reason you can still see that traffic, if you try to open the web GUI or control that device, you won't be able to. You may see it discover, via Bonjour, but if you try to open the web interface, it won't allow you to. So making sure that your devices, your computer, if you're trying to set those up, making sure that you're on the same subnet will allow you to do that.
Okay, we talked a lot about switches, so making sure that you're using the right kind of switch and that it's configured properly. How often would you say that comes up? How many
That comes
times
up
per day?
Yeah, that comes up fairly often throughout the day, so many times a day, using unqualified switches that are either unmanaged or they have green Ethernet on them and you can't turn it off, or there are some switches that have IGMP enabled and you can't turn it off, either using a 10100 switch, or there are other switches that have their own time or syncing protocol that messes up with the clock sync with our devices. So making sure you're using a switch that is qualified but is also not on the disqualified list is probably the best. And in most cases, we've seen from experience, and also Audinate has used at their trade shows, but also in testing, the Cisco SG, either the 200 or the Cisco SG 300 switch, which is fully managed, allows you to turn off those green Ethernet features and also IGMP snooping.
And as Gino always likes to point out, if you're spending $20,000 or $30,000 on AV hardware for a meeting room, don't buy a $50 switch, right?
Exactly, exactly. If say you have $20 or $30,000 worth of equipment and you're using a unmanaged switch from down the street or Best Buy or Walgreens, it may not be the best switch for this situation. Keeping that in mind, those Cisco switches are roughly $100, $150 or so, maybe a little bit more as you get larger into like 52 port switches. Those are $200 or $300, but it is a necessary component to your networked audio system.
All right, and then finally, apps, firmware versions not compatible and updated. How does that manifest itself, or why is that such a problem?
In firmware versions, we're always updating and providing bug fixes and improvements to the system, whether it's in our devices or on the Dante side of things. So making sure, that you have the devices that are up to date, or you've used Shure Update utility to push it to the latest firmware is always helpful. If you're ever running into issues with a device that is acting weird or it doesn't have a feature set that you're looking for example, the MXA 910, you need to be updated to version 2.08 or later in order for AES 67 to work at all. So making sure that is done, and making sure the Shure Update utility is allowed through your computer's firewall is a necessity.
Got it. And we talked about apps and coming through the firewall and so forth. Cables, are we still talking about cables?
We are still
It's
talking.
2018. We are still talking about cables.
The physical realm is still there. Making sure your cables are not pinched or cut or faulty in any way,
those
or
little tabs.
those little tabs that you plug in the Ethernet cable to your switch. I've had, in more cases than I want to admit, issues with servers or network devices going down. Come to find out many hours, many migraines later, that it was not fully plugged in to whichever port it was, because the little clip was off, and it caused a lot of pain.
on a $10 cable.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, before we get to taking questions, and I'm sure there are a bunch of them, so we've got plenty of time, which is good. People sometimes ask, how are we recording this webinar? What's our setup? So I made up a slide about that. So we're using 3 of our KSM-8 dynamic cardioid microphones plugged into an SCM-820 automatic mixer. Then the output of the mixer is going into our handy-dandy MVI digital interface, which basically is a front end for the microphone of your choice, and supplies phantom power even. And then outputs that to USB, and so you can plug it into your laptop. Even comes with a cable with a lightning connector, so you can do this all over your tablet or your iPhone if you want to. So it's a simple setup, but works great, sounds great, and pretty portable too. Now, Cheryl, what about questions? Are there any questions?
All right, we have one. So please, if you have a question, get those in now, because we've got time. All right, so question number 1. Here we go. What can happen if we use a PoE switch that is not PoE plus with the P300? Will there be any damage?
What you will see is that it will power on. The P300 will power on, but as soon as you start using more processing power, you start using AEC channels, AGC, some of the other features that are involved in the P300, they either won't work or they'll just be disabled. I haven't really fully tested some of the features that won't work or what necessarily happens at that time, but you won't get the performance that you're looking for, because as you start to use more features within the P300, it's starting to use more power. And if that power is not there, you're going to have problems.
So this could be kind of a gotcha, because
Good.
you could be setting up the system and plugging it in and say, oh, okay, it's
Turns
lights
on,
up,
yeah,
good.
lights on.
All right, now I'll go do something else. And then when you finally start, enabling processing blocks and running audio through it and so forth, then you'll start getting hiccups and problems.
Yes, it uses like AEC, AGC, noise reduction. I mean, there are so many different features that are involved in the P300 that, yes, it will power on initially, but as you start routing things to all of its 10 Dante inputs using the mobile input, the analog inputs and outs, it doesn't have a power block that goes to it. There's no, power cable that you plug into it. It's receiving all of that power over the network cable from your switch. And we recommend or require that to be a PoE plus switch to provide all the power that's needed for that.
Got it.
Okay. This is more of a comment, but if you guys have anything to say about it. Regarding cables, it's worth mentioning not to couple the cables with cable ties, especially with other cabling like power, etc.
Yes, yep, I would agree with that. Keeping your power and your Ethernet separate to avoid any crosstalk or potential for interference. But also, whenever you are tying those cables together, not to tie them too tight, where you're pinching the Ethernet cables, which can also, maybe not instantly, but down the road, cause potential breakage of the cable.
So when you're putting zip ties around cables onto the leg of a table or something like that, squishing them really hard isn't a good idea.
That is not a good idea. That
Okay.
can cause problems, not necessarily right away, but down the road.
Okay. Can we use a 100 bass T-switch for Dante audio in a dedicated audio network?
100 base T, I wouldn't recommend it. If you could go gigabit, I would say just go gigabit all the way. Not to say that it would not work or that we have not, we've seen it not work. It's potentially could work totally fine, especially for a small AV network. But for the price of gigabit switches nowadays, it's almost worth it to stay gigabit. That will give you the ability to expand your networked audio system. Say if you wanted to add more devices or more channels, just to make sure you're gigabit straight off the bat.
Okay. What is the importance, if any, of using shielded network cables?
In shielded, I've seen it less of an issue, especially for networked audio. It's more of a case with our DIS products that you would want to use shielded cable because there's so much power running through the DIS or the DCS LAN from your central unit to your microphones or your portable or flush mount microphones and loudspeakers, because that also houses video as well. But if you're using unshielded for MXA 910, ANI 4 ins and outs, that's totally fine. We haven't heard of anything on the support side of using shielded versus unshielded will have these issues or problems. We use shielded in testing and unshielded in testing as well.
And this might be one of those cases where it's not so much shielded cable that matters, but just good quality cable, with good internal construction and high data throughput and so forth. And a shielded cable might often be that cable anyway.
Right, yeah. That will give you the assurance that you would need in a shielded cable, but it's not as much of an issue as making sure that you have good cables. Nothing's broken, the clips are still on, and they can seat correctly into the port.
Okay. If you're setting up a small Dante-only network, is it still necessary to use a managed switch?
Yes, if Dante is anywhere at all on the network, it is essential to use a managed switch. That is, some of the unmanaged, maybe for example the ProSafe switches, they have green Ethernet. And even if you're using one Dante transmitter and one Dante receiver, that green Ethernet can mess up audio flows, or all of a sudden you won't hear audio at a certain time, say in low bandwidth. But having the option to manage those protocols to turn green Ethernet and IGMP or other multicast filtering settings off is, I'd say, a necessity for any Dante network that you have.
Because otherwise, that's going to be the thing that makes people call you when you least want to get that call, saying, we're not hearing anything.
And all of a sudden you reboot the switch, it comes back up for maybe an hour or so, and you say, job's done. You go off-site, and they'll call you again to say, hey, we can't hear audio anymore. What happened? So just making sure you have a managed switch will mitigate those problems.
And of course, when those people call, they don't call and say, the switch keeps shutting down.
Exactly.
They say, the microphone keeps turning off.
Microphone keeps going off, or, I can't hear audio. What's going on from my MXA 910? It's going to whichever receiver. I can't hear audio. Do I have to send the microphone back in? Nope. The usual question we ask first is, what network switch are you using? And if it's an unmanaged switch, that could be the major problem.
Got it.
Is there any difference between sending on an AES 67 stream instead of Dante?
Some devices like the QSC Core 10, they use AES67. They don't support Dante. So if, say, your Biamp or Dante virtual sound card is there and it supports Dante, by all means, use Dante. AES67, that is more so an interoperability protocol between Dante devices and other devices that don't support Dante, but they may support AES67. So if whatever receiver you have does support Dante, use that. If it supports AES67, then go with AES.
Okay. Next question. Any plans to integrate the DIS systems into the world of Dante and AES 67?
That's a good question. Our stock answer, of course, is that we don't comment on future product plans, but it could happen. The world of conferencing and that type of system is a little bit different than general meeting room design, and I don't think Dante has been as popular there yet. But we're working with a lot of users at all levels of government, education, business, and if that's something people want, we'll probably do it.
Okay. If going beyond 100 meters, what switch can I use, or how do I do a hop?
That is a good question. That is the restriction of most cabling, or that is Ethernet cabling. It's 100 meters. Once you go beyond that, you're looking at either putting in a different site or a different location. There are other, say, amplifiers for connecting longer sets of cabling to each other, but I haven't come up with a use case, or I haven't heard of a use case, especially in the Dante realm, that would work. If you're trying to extend beyond 100 meters and go maybe 500 feet, you're looking at more so fiber at that point, fiber optics cable to go from one location to the other. So if you can, I mean, it's recommended that I would say stay below 100 meters. That is around 300 or so feet. Once you go beyond that length, PoE will stop working. Just basic communication across your Ethernet will stop working. So if you do need to go longer distances, that's something you may want to speak with the IT manager involved to see what or how they can set that up for you.
Right. In our conferencing products, we have things like repeaters and outboard power supplies and so forth to deal with these kind of long cable run issues. Right. And I assume there's similar types of hardware on the market to deal with that in the Ethernet realm.
There are, yes, repeaters or amplifiers, PoE amplifiers, if you're going longer distances. As far as testing those, I have not heard of tests for that on the Audinate or Dante side of whether those would work properly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This person uses wireless workbench to monitor RF frequency on the ULXD4Q and set the gain on the unit. Can he still control the gain on the mixing board through Dante?
I don't think that is more so the Dante side. That is actually control. You're sending control messages on the control IP of your ULXD. It's not necessarily Dante audio at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You're discovering the ULXD in wireless workbench over Bonjour and multicast data, but most of that traffic is indeed control traffic and not really Dante audio.
Okay, so you're basically sending a control string to the receiver that says, turn the level up or something like that?
Right, and that's all done via its control IP address.
Right.
Okay. Can Dante be used on the same switch as AVB?
I've seen this happen before, where in Dante controller, if you have a switch with AVB or some other precision time protocol, that you may have some issues on Dante syncing or clock syncing, because you have Dante's precision time protocol working, but you also have a switch with AVB, which also has its own precision time protocol working at the same time. And in Dante controller, you may see multiple master clocks, where you would really only want to see one master clock at a time. As soon as you start to see multiple master clocks, that's when things will start muting, or some weird things will start to happen within Dante controller. So if you have an AVB switch, it may be good to look on whether you can disable either the AVB side of it or the precision time protocol that uses.
Okay. Here we go. We got a longish one.
Mhm.
I'm on a large campus and am at the mercy of the IT department to handle my Dante network. Sources in other buildings, after multiple hops, have digital clicks in my building. Is there a way to interrogate the data flow to see what switch is causing the problem?
That's a good question. As you're going over switch hops, you're adding latency to the Dante network. If there's a way to do a trace route, you can. I think it's trace ROUTE in Windows. I think trace RT in Mac, or that could be vice versa, where you can trace an IP address just to see how many hops it goes through before it reaches its destination. In that case, maybe you see a hop where it takes like 200 milliseconds to get across that. That may be the issue, or that may be the area to focus on. But that's a good question to raise with the IT that you have involved there, whether they can either reduce the number of hops or get you onto a LAN that is either more isolated, or yeah, that's a good question to ask the IT engineer. Not necessarily sure what you can do in that case once you have them involved, and there's so many switches that it's going through. That may be the only way you can do it, but possibly putting a receiver or a Dante network closer to your receiver may be the best option.
Mhm.
All right. Well, that looks like that wraps up all of our questions. If there's one that you were too shy to type or one that pops into your head later, you can always send those to support@shure.com. We have a great team of applications engineer specialists that can answer many, many questions across a wide variety of topics. So that is at support@shure.com. One last question just popped up asking if the webinar will be posted on YouTube. It will not be on YouTube, but it will be at shure.com/training, and it will be available about a week or so after our broadcast. So hopefully sometime early or mid next week. Shure.com/training. Also at our blog.shure.com. You can find it there by searching. So that wraps up for today. We want to thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have a great day, and we hope you see you next time.